Hello, everyone. The webinar will be starting momentarily. Thank you. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third session in the Product Safety and Crisis Management webinar series, sponsored by UL. We have another great session planned for you all today, and we're happy that you've joined us. I'm Beth Ann Yacobu, and I am the Executive Director of the Emerson Leadership Institute. We are a center of excellence in the Chaffetz School of Business at St. Louis University. We design and deliver professional development programs and leadership training that shape and enable ethical leaders. The Emerson Leadership Institute and our partner, ADK Information Services, along with UL, are so excited to bring you this series. And we are very fortunate and grateful to have a wonderful moderator and collaborator in Lisa Trophy. She's the managing director of the Juvenile Products Manufacturing Association, and she will be moderating again today for this session. So with that, I will hand it over to Lisa to introduce our presenters for today and to get us started. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Beth Ann, and welcome once again, everyone, to our third session of this first webinar series in 2021. We're so glad you've joined us, and as Beth Ann mentioned, this series has been designed by the Emerson Leadership Institute in conjunction with St. Louis University School of Business, and we are very grateful to our friends and partners at UL for their generous support and sponsorship of this important webinar series. And again, the vision for the series is really to bring a virtual experience of university level education to those of you out in the field who many of us are unable to still travel here these times. So thank you for joining us virtually. And we are really looking forward to today's session. Today's session is managing people during crisis. And before I introduce our distinguished panelists, I have just a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording this session, and recordings will be available for all 4 of the sessions on the SPSP website, and they will all be posted there before the conclusion of the series, which is next week. I would encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to enter questions as you think of them. We have a really robust set of content today, and so we'll make time hopefully in between our panelists, but as well as at the end. So please enter your questions there as you think of them, and stay tuned for an announcement at the end of today's session about how you can earn a certificate of completion for participating in the course over these few weeks. And so we're joined today by 3 very well-rounded speakers who will each share a different perspective on managing the people part of our business, and never more so important than during a crisis. So the perspectives include industry, regulatory agency, and trade association. Now, our first speaker today is Heather Bramble, Head of Regulatory Affairs at Mattel. Her product safety and regulatory compliance experience is vast and significant. Heather's a senior policy advisor and litigator, and she served as partner at Venable, chief counsel and policy advisor to Commissioner Robinson at the CPSC, and most recently, before joining Mattel, served as the senior corporate counsel at Amazon in global product assurance, safety, and compliance. Matt Hauser is our second panelist today, and he'll be representing the agency perspective. Now, originally, Inez Tenenbaum was slated to present here today, former chairman of the Consumer Product Safety Commission. I know many of you know her well, but unfortunately, she was unable to join us at the last minute. So Matt has graciously stepped in to share her perspective and the agency perspective on managing people in crisis. Matt is currently serving as special counsel and chair of Cooley's North American Product Safety Practice, and he previously served as the chair of the Consumer Product Safety Practice at Mintz, as well as in the role of chief of staff at the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Matt currently serves on the ICPHSO board of directors and is a former chairman of the board as well. And finally, I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming Kelly Mariotti, Executive Director of the Juvenile Products Manufacturers Association, where she has served since 2013. Prior to JPMA, Kelly founded and operated a successful baby products business for nearly 2 decades, during which time she also served on the board of directors for JPMA. She subsequently served as the Chief Staff Officer of First Candle, which is a nonprofit organization focused on SIDS and safe sleep. And finally, Kelly's a spokesperson for the juvenile products industry and is certainly no stranger to managing during a crisis. So welcome to all of our panelists today. Thanks again to our participants. This is going to be a very robust session. And again, I encourage you to enter your questions into the Q&A as you think of them, and we'll tackle as many as we can. So without further ado, let's welcome Heather.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa. Excited to be here today. And as Lisa noted, I made a recent move from Amazon to Mattel and absolutely enjoying that. But most of the examples, when we get to them, I'll be talking about is from my experience at Amazon, just because of the recent move just in November was my transition. So we'll go to the next slide. Great. So today I'm going to walk through sort of, as we said, managing people during the crisis. Before you can do that, you obviously have to identify the crisis. So we'll spend a quick couple of minutes just sort of looking at the perspective of the company or even your organization within the company on what they think is a crisis or what input your team or your group has in a crisis situation. Because a lot of times that actually defines how you end up managing your team or your organization, because what functional role you play during a crisis really makes a difference. So we'll go through the approach, who the responsible leaders are, how specifically you look at your team and manage your people, and we'll go through most of the time we'll spend on 2 examples. Next slide. So when we're thinking about what is a crisis within a company, it's really important, how is the company evaluating a crisis situation? And a lot of times there'll be functional evaluations, like are there physical risks to people or products in a company? Is there a financial consequence? Is there a reputational harm? What does that look like? And what's the legal risk? And I think when you're thinking about managing your team, one of the big questions that you need to think about is how do you fit into that evaluation? What is going to be your team's responsibility in evaluating those issues to be presented to senior leadership? And if so, how are you going to do that within your team? Because as we know, right, there's all different kinds of crises, right? So one that we're all living in right now, the global pandemic of COVID-19, obviously a health crisis, but that will have implications across all different types of industries. Similarly, we've spent in some of the previous seminars of this series, there's been a real focus on when the product is at crisis, right? The product safety issue. And one example I'm going to go through later is we remember a couple of years ago, the romaine lettuce market withdrawals, which was a huge product crisis. But then we also can have supply chain crises. And that, sometimes that might have nothing to do with product safety, but as a product safety organization, you're going to feel the consequences of that, right? So maybe there's a war right outside your factories and all of a sudden your factories are all shut down, or there's a picket line, or there's a labor dispute. Whatever that might be, it might have a severe impact on your supply chain, and you may need to evaluate all the risks and harms and then be able to present to senior leaders on how you're going to deal with that disruption. And then finally, sometimes it's an entire company-wide crisis. Like before I was involved in product safety, I was a securities litigator. We often came in and looked at large companies and they were going through government investigations into, securities fraud. And it was a crisis at the company. It didn't matter. Everybody was involved. So I think these are key touch points that we need to think about as we think about how we manage our teams. Next slide. And then some specific questions, right? So is there a specific or ad hoc response depending on the crisis, right? Like we just went through, like what's your company's profile and what's your role in dealing with it? Is there a general crisis management protocol or plan or playbook? And is there a standing crisis management team, right? So those are some, like in crisis management consulting and in the research, these are the key points of reference. And a lot of times, depending on where your organization sits within the entire company, or where your position sits within your organization, maybe there is, a general crisis management plan and crisis management team for the entire company, but you are in a space where you need to figure out what that is for your specific team. And so one of the things that often I'll talk to different groups within the organization is like, do you know exactly what your function is? when there is all of a sudden a red alert and everybody goes to crisis mode, what are your people doing and what is your responsibility? Which leads us to the next slide. So oftentimes companies will have a standing crisis management team. It may only involve the very senior leaders, right, of the company. And you'll be asked to sort of drop everything and report in. So when you're working with your individual teams, do you need to bring in cross-functional people to help provide that data? Like, do you need to work with the financial team? Do you need to work with the PR team? How is what your work doing and your team doing affected by whatever the crisis is? And sort of as a corollary to that, do you need external resources, right? Do you need an outside counsel to come in to help you? Do you need outside PR team come in and talk to you? And I know, like, often the ICFSO meetings will talk about that, like who are the best resources to use in which context. But that's got to be a key piece of figuring out how you're going to manage your people. Are you also managing external teams? And are you also going to co-manage other internal functional teams? Because that will go into how you can get to the best result. And then the third thing is, are you doing ongoing training with your people? Like, do they know, like, this is the playbook, this is how we do it? And do you have game days? Do you have tabletop exercises? Because the truth is, when you get into the middle of the crisis, if that's the first time you've looked at the manual, you're going to have a problem, right? But if it's, you do them quarterly and everybody sort of expects, like, oh, I need to call this person, I need to check off this, I need to do this protocol on the computer, and we get everything signed up, and then I send it off to my manager, that's a much better situation to be in. And does everybody actually know who has the authority to make the decisions when you get into the crisis? That's a very critical point. And I've seen in lots of different contexts where all of a sudden everybody goes off to do something, they come back, nobody knows who's going to make the decision. And that's often a stumbling block when you get into a serious crisis situation. Next slide. So one way to solve that is, right, having a well-defined RACI. And, at Amazon, we use that a lot. We use it at Mattel. When I've been outside counsel, that's been a key thing that I've advised clients to have that set up ahead of time. And often they'll be in these big spreadsheets, they'll be color-coded, and it looks great, it's on paper, but can your team live the RACI is often the question, right? And the way you test that and you pressure test that with your team is going through the actual game day, going through the tabletop exercise where you can't get to the next step until you get the decision made. And I've seen that done in lots of different ways. It could be very engaging. It could actually make your team feel extremely invested in the process. And in the end, when the crisis hits, it really makes a difference. And so with that, we'll go to the next slide. And I'll talk a little bit, spend a little bit of time on the romaine lettuce market withdrawal. I don't know if everybody remembers because it's been so long ago now since COVID, but in 2018, right before Thanksgiving, there was a huge market withdrawal of romaine lettuce. Literally, the CDC came out and said, don't serve people lettuce at Thanksgiving, which is kind of a crazy thing to say. At the time I was at Amazon, we had stores, we have, home delivery of food, we had whole food markets. And so we had to internally run that message throughout, all of our customers, all of our stores, all of our associates. And what was amazing is we did have a playbook, and we actually had game day, very similar exercise. So there was a time there was sort of chaos in the market, and there was a crisis on our team, but everybody knew what to do. Everyone knew who the players were. Everyone knew who we had to get a sign-offs on for which actions we had to take. We already had our consultants in place. We knew who at the trade association we needed to meet with. Look, it was crisis mode, like, 24 hours a day, every day for right before Thanksgiving, but there was no crisis in how we were going to handle it. And that to me is a perfect example of when you've done the training and you've been able to prepare for something that you should expect to occur. And managing people in that situation becomes very easy, right? Because you're like, everyone go to the playbook, right? Everyone, let's check in at 4 o'clock. I want to see everybody's, action items. I want to see the tracker. Let's get to the next call. Let's take the next actions and move on to the next day. Next slide is when you get the black swan. So, right, I don't think we could have necessarily anticipated that there would be a global pandemic. I didn't anticipate that. But when we sort of were going through that process, you use the same tools, right? And so that's what's key about practicing, a crisis situation. You can then apply it to other situations. So one of the key things that we did at Amazon was very quickly work streams were identified. We sort of chunked the crisis into different teams. There were daily, weekly, monthly stand-up meetings. We took already in place RACIs, overlaid it on the key action items that we had to do, and tracked them minute by minute. Brought in internal cross-functional teams, external advisors, and everybody sort of had a plan, right? I mean, it was super intense. I'm sure many of you have had the experience over the last couple of, or almost a year, but we sort of worked through the issue just as we did romaine lettuce, but on a much larger scale, like globally with everybody, stores, associates, corporate, products, food, everything. And one of the things I think is a huge takeaway for that was, our work changed. All of a sudden, everybody was working from home. So I think another key part to managing people is to understanding the morale and the temperament of your team. And that was something that, we spent a lot of time throughout the crisis and making sure like everyone was okay. Like you're working really hard, you're working from home. People have, their kids are at home. How do you incorporate sort of breaks, happy hours, checking in, because the crisis has now become a year-long situation. And so I think when you're managing people, that's a key thing, a key takeaway from there. Next slide. And then this actually has a bunch of different points. I think we're going to put this in the chat so you'll have it, but some articles that really focus in on what to think about when you have a small team, large team, and part of a bigger enterprise organization, and how do you work through the crisis situation with your people. I think we'll go to the next presenter.
Thank you, Heather, so much for that terrific information. We don't have any questions coming through just yet, so I'll remind you all participants to use the Q&A function as you think of those questions. And we will next hear from Matt. Matt, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Lisa. So as was mentioned at the beginning, I am your substitute for Inez, my former boss. When I was at the CPSC, I served as her chief of staff and chief counsel. Going to bring the view of how things were managed at the CPSC during that time frame. That doesn't mean that's how they're managed now. Or that it's representative of anything more than that. And I think that, one of the things that Inez stresses throughout this, her deck here, is the cohesiveness of the team. And as we were implementing CPSIA from 2009 to 2013, that's something that we absolutely had at the agency. And, as you're managing people, especially during crisis situations, it's absolutely necessary. Friction is one of the worst things you can possibly have. So, as a demonstration, when she called me about this, she didn't even have to ask. I said, yes, even though I haven't had a chance to prepare, absolutely, I'll slip in. We're still a pretty cohesive team, even after the fact, long after the CPSC. And, that's something that just, it's hard to capture, but to the extent that you have problems, which we did while we were at the CPSC, I won't say it was all, fun and easy. It's something that you have to deal with, and deal with quickly. So, just something that I know she would emphasize a lot, is that cohesiveness and making sure that everybody's rowing in the same direction, that any wrinkles are ironed out and you confront issues, as they arise instead of ignoring them and letting them fester, which can really cause problems down the line. So if we can go to the next slide. Um, so why managing a crisis is important. This is somewhat common sense, in terms of the quote here from Warren Buffett about, it takes 5 minutes to ruin a reputation that you've spent 20 years building. I actually think that in today's world of cancel culture, it's even shorter. A 15-second video clip, that's posted on Twitter, can have the same effect, and maybe it only takes 5 minutes for it to go viral. But given kind of how quickly information and misinformation spreads, nowadays, it's incredibly important to have plans in place and to be on top of a crisis as much as possible at the outset, and really spare no expense. One of the things we heard at the beginning of the pandemic was, at least I heard it, was, we'll know we have prepared correctly if we look back and it looks like we overreacted, or we over prepared, or we went too far with the restrictions, and that's something that I think goes into how much you're doing up front, putting a lot of energy in at the initial stages, which I'll get into why that's important, with a CPSC example later. But anyways, I just wanted to stay on this slide for a minute because I think it's really important to emphasize how quickly this can turn into a disaster and how long it takes you to repair the reputation afterwards. It takes a lot longer to do that. And for all the reasons that Inez has mentioned here on the results slide or bullet points there. If we can go to the next slide. So in terms of a crisis management plan, I didn't have to change Inez's slides at all because I didn't disagree with them, even though I didn't get much of a chance to look at them. This is a really good set of principles to go by in terms of having a plan, having people identified, and also planning how you're going to respond and work with external parties outside of your company, whether it's the media, Congress, regulators, whoever it may be. One thing that Heather mentioned, which I definitely agree with, is tabletop exercises. Getting people experienced, especially if you get new people into a company that are taking new positions. Really important to get people trained up and knowing what to do in crisis types of situations. And how often you do that, I think, is an internal decision, but certainly something that makes sense. And another thing that, I would potentially, put in here is, what is a crisis, right? A recall is not a crisis in most cases. I do them every day, and work on them every day. And for the most part, they're not high profile, to be totally honest. I know it feels that way, but they're generally not something that, ends a company. And so for the most part, one of the big, things in terms of working with a crisis management plan is, when do we actually need to use it? And when are we in this situation, and setting out some, criteria and guidelines around that is important, to not, potentially overreact. As I was saying earlier, is a good thing. Sometimes you can go too far, and it's important to know, what's a big issue and what's not. And in my experience, that's fairly obvious to to tell. One thing in terms of why it's important to have a plan and why it's important to execute on it. One of my other mentors in life, Chuck Samuels, who I worked with at Mintz, one of his key quotes was, "You don't get penalized for doing a recall. You get penalized for doing a recall poorly." And I feel like that is a really, really good mantra for both companies in a recall situation, and also something like the CPSC in a situation where they're dealing with a product crisis. Executing it poorly and dealing with it poorly is where you see that play up in the media. And you see Congress getting involved and saying that the agency is quote unquote dropping the ball. And so that's why it's really important to have a plan and with these elements and the things that Heather was mentioned earlier. If we can go to the next slide. So who should be on the team? This is a great list. Somebody who's a crisis manager, kind of a project manager as well. Somebody who's in charge of keeping the trains moving is incredibly important. That's probably the thing that I see missed the most on these teams. You have a bunch of key players and key decision makers, but you don't have somebody internally tying it all together and responsible for making sure that everybody's doing what they should be. So you could kind of put a crisis/project manager there. And then of course your subject matter experts, the people who weigh in on the substance, and your legal team if needed, public affairs or lobbyists if you've got an issue on the Hill with Congress. That's something that's important. And then another thing that Heather mentioned again is somebody that's empowered to make decisions. What's the clear line of authority within this team? Decision by consensus is how some companies operate, and in some companies it works, but generally it's good to have somebody with a clear line of authority to move and make decisions and move things forward. We can go to the next slide. So the issue of problem drywall at the CPSC, which came in from mostly China, and was just a nightmare of a situation. As I mentioned earlier, in terms of managing things correctly from the get-go, I'll be honest and say that the CPSC didn't in 2008. Which conveniently is before we got there, whenever we came to the agency. But one of the first things that happened with the issue of drywall was that you had the CDC, the CPSC, and the EPA fighting over whose is this? Whose jurisdiction is this? It's not ours. It's EPA's. It's not EPA's. It's a CDC issue because it's a public health issue. That's not good leadership, to be totally honest and blunt. And eventually Congress decided where the jurisdiction was going to lie, and the primary jurisdiction was going to lie with the CPSC. And the CPSC begrudgingly accepted it. And I will say that when Inez came to the agency, she embraced it. And that was something where it was a difficult ship to turn around in terms of the perception that had already been created of the CPSC dropping the ball on these types of things. But eventually we got there by all the ways that she has in her slides here. You had Congress involved in this, you had media all over it. And the reason was because you had people who couldn't live in their homes. I mean, it's just a terrible situation, or they were living in their homes, but literally suffering as they were doing it, from headaches and watery eyes and all of the things that came along with the off-gassing of the hydrogen sulfide from the drywall, not to mention corrosion of metal and things like that. So all of this created kind of a crisis situation. At the same time, we were implementing the CPSIA, which was kind of no small task, but something that we were able to kind of do both at the same time. We can go to the next slide. So what was the agency response? This was primarily actually driven by my predecessor in the chief of staff position, Rebecca Sinhauser, who really kind of took the reins and developed an internal plan, made sure that the agency had the people, the right people on the team, the right resources for that team to operate, and a clear plan. Those things were quite honestly lacking, and she really pulled those together, and had at one point 30 people around a table in a room discussing kind of how the agency was going to grasp this issue and move forward. Go to the next slide. So the agency's response was, again, this is part of turning that ship around, was to invest in the best scientific research possible to identify the problem and how to remediate it. And at the same time, the agency was trying to go after the companies mostly from China. So jurisdiction and enforcement was difficult, but it was attempted to try and get the companies who were responsible for producing this to take account for it, potentially do a recall. And all of this was done with a transparent approach where there was kind of regular updates to the media, to Congress, and to homeowners, all of whom were very active on this issue. Very transparent about it from the agency perspective, more transparent than agencies generally like to be, and which was a little bit uncomfortable and unnerving for a lot of people on the team, but somewhere that it had to go in terms of providing information in such a way that people were feeling like the agency was making progress on the issue. If we can go to the next slide. So this is just kind of more steps as what we were talking about. The chairman, Inez, went and visited homeowners. I was on that trip. Stepping into one of those homes was certainly an experience. At that point, the agency, kind of became a part of the story as well, in terms of that was documented and written about in Florida newspapers, at least. Sent an investigative team to China. This is one of the more interesting things, where a team was actually permitted to go into China. But we were very transparent about where the team was not allowed to go, and what they were not allowed to see and what they were not allowed to get. And we're very transparent about that with the media to make sure that as we had limitations on what we could do based on where they were allowed to inspect, that we broadcasted what those were to Congress and to the media and others. Of course, we developed the guidance that really we couldn't get a recall because these companies were in China. But developed the guidance on remediation and identification of drywall, problem drywall, and then joined forces with other agencies. And this is, that kind of fisticuffs at the beginning of the problem drywall situation never necessarily went away. And there was also an element of coercion. Or not, coercion's maybe not the wrong word, but or not the right word, but making sure that company or other agencies were cooperating and pulling what they needed to pull from their perspective, and being transparent with Congress when they weren't. And that's how we kind of got to a place where all of the federal agencies that needed to be involved were involved and were doing what they needed to do in order to get at least some relief to homeowners in terms of identifying whether they had the drywall in their house, and if so, how to remediate the situation. If we can go to the next slide. So this is just more about the transparent response, providing reports to Congress, and information to the public and media kind of readouts, all done. And the approach, managing that team was one where everybody, again, regular meetings, somebody in that meeting who was tying everything together at the end of the meeting, saying, kind of recapping what was discussed, what the to-dos were, who had responsibility for them, and when they were going to be done by, and when we were going to meet again to update, all of these things. And that was kind of a process that Rebecca put in place and that carried throughout this issue, which lasted quite some time until actually, from the litigation perspective, a lot of the homeowners were able to get relief from one of the major companies that was overseas and had imported the drywall. Next slide. So I'm over time, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but high profile recalls all have these same things in common in terms of managing all of these competing interests. And again, that upfront work is incredibly important in terms of making sure that you have all of these bases covered when you do encounter a high profile situation. Really important to make sure that you've got everything covered from a regulatory perspective, from a congressional perspective, from a media perspective, your litigation risks covered, and you have the right people on the team to do that. And you have the right team in place, the right process in place to make sure all of that's being managed simultaneously, because that's not an easy thing to do in not only high profile, but usually pressure packed situations. Next slide, please. Elements of a successful recall here. Again, just kind of more of the same of what I was saying earlier. Another thing I would add to this is a really, really well done corrective action plan, which includes the logistics of how you're going to execute the recall and what the remedy is, how you're going to get it to consumers, how you're identifying the scope of the issue. All of those things are incredibly important. Communications to affected consumers, really, really important to have here as well. Next slide. So lessons learned. I didn't have a chance to go over this slide in terms of Inez's personal lessons learned. I will say that I think I know what she's talking about with the CEO and chairman, type of what she would probably characterize as interference, and senior management kind of coming in. And that's something that can happen where people in those positions try and take charge of the situation when they don't have the expertise. And that's a delicate issue to deal with because, usually in those situations, it's, make a decision and, move on and just kind of move on to the next meeting and the next thing. And a lot of these situations require a lot more thought than that. And so that's something you have to really push back on in a very gentle way from an internal perspective. From the CPSC perspective, we had that with other commissioners and their staff as we were dealing with the drywall issue. And you got to know really when to try and get their buy-in and work with them and brief them, and also when to just lead. That's another situation. At some point, you've got to just put a foot forward and say, this is what we're doing and this is the plan, even if there's disagreement. So that kind of goes in all of those different contexts. At some point, you do have to make a decision and move forward. So I think that's it for right now, and we'll go to the next speaker.
Thanks, Matt. Before we move on to Kelly, just one quick question for you here. Is CPSC's internal crisis management standard operating procedure available to the public?
The CPSC has a different operating procedure for every issue that it may encounter, in my experience. And so it's not something that I think is a standard type of procedure. At least it wasn't while I was there. It was, we've got an issue with a toy that a consumer group is saying needs to be recalled, and it's like the hottest toy of the year, which happened in 2010, I think. That situation was different, obviously, from the Chinese or the problem drywall situation. So it's different in each situation from the CPSC perspective. Whether they've actually put a quote unquote crisis plan into place, I don't know. It's one of those where the CPSC is almost always in a crisis of some sort. So there's a lot of muscle memory in terms of putting these teams together. But from that perspective, it'd be a little bit different in that they're so multifaceted in terms of the issues that the agency faces. That it would probably be difficult to put anything other than something really high level into place.
Great, thank you for that. And thank you for that great presentation and pitching in for Inez at the last minute. We certainly appreciate it. And
Absolutely.
so next we will hear from Kelly Mariotti.
Okay, I think you can hear me now. Hi, everyone. And I'd like to thank ADK, UL, and the Emerson Leadership Institute for... Okay, now, thank yous to ADK, UL, and the Emerson Leadership Institute for including JPMA and the association perspective in this dialogue about crisis management, which is a very important topic to us. Next slide, please. If you're not familiar with JPMA, this is our mission statement. In a nutshell, we represent the manufacturers in the baby products industry. Next slide. And you'll notice at the top of our mission statement that JPMA is the voice of the industry on quality and safety. And most trade associations fill this role to some degree, acting as the voice of the industry, especially in times of crisis. What's different is that a trade association rarely, or if ever, has direct contact with the product. So as such, for us, crisis management does equal people management. So for those of you that are attending this whole webinar series, we really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the people management part of this process. Next slide. So when you're in a crisis, or speaking of crisis, particularly if you're in private industry, it's easy to think about acute crisis and your internal people management. Perhaps you might think about how you're going to dialogue with the regulators and with the media, but most of your crisis plan is related to your internal staff. In most crises, however, there is an external exposure to a variety of stakeholders that may be implicated both in the short term and in the long term as the crisis unfolds. Sometimes those are obvious, and sometimes they're people that are already within your own stakeholder group as an organization, but sometimes it goes far beyond that as well. So what this chart does is, shows you some examples, consultants, people from your C-suite, people in related product categories, competitors of yours, communication staff, regulators, consumers, et cetera, et cetera. And even if this doesn't align with your own set of stakeholders, what it does is it aligns with the stakeholder groups that most trade associations identify and have some relationship with as well. Next slide. So getting ahead of myself, if I can provide you with one takeaway today, it's that your trade association doesn't just have a role to play in your crisis. It's really a critical partner in your crisis. And you need to reach out to your trade association as early as possible during your crisis, and as the situation unfolds, keeping them very much in the loop. Next slide. So diving into that just a little bit deeper, why is your trade association so important? And there's really two reasons. One, duck and cover. That's what we're here for as associations. Media will almost always reach out to the trade association very early in the process when there's a crisis, asking for a statement. And if we're connected with your communications people and we can align our statement, we understand your perspective on the crisis, it helps us craft a statement that is much more consistent and also can often help craft the future dialogue. So we can provide context, we can provide facts or mitigating circumstances that are often hard for the company itself to get across. So, in baby products, it's never popular in the media to speak to the parent's responsibility if they've misused a product or used a product in a way it wasn't intended. Those are sometimes facts that we can work into our statement so the company doesn't have to say those things itself. We can also start to set up future advocacy work with the product or in the product category, again, by adjusting the narrative in how the media is talking about the product. So that sense of duck and cover is something that's certainly very important. The other aspect of it is practice makes perfect. So hopefully as a business, even as a large business, you don't deal with a lot of crises. As Matt said, a recall isn't necessarily a crisis. And it's hopefully a skill that most companies just don't have to hone. In the trade association world, we deal in crisis a lot. It's certainly a core function of ours. We have crisis management set up as just part of our core operating procedures and something that we talk about and deal with on an ongoing basis. So often we've had a lot of experience with very different types of crisis, and we can even help you if you're new to it or if there's team members who are new to it to talk through the response and how we might be able to help you have the best possible result. Next slide. So driving a bit deeper, some of the questions that we ask are very similar to what Heather and Matt indicated. We ask, what is a crisis? How do we prepare for crisis and manage it? How long does a crisis last? Which is something we haven't touched on yet that I want to talk about a little bit, and then some takeaways for you as well. Next slide. So what is a crisis? Again, Heather and Matt both noted that there's all different kinds of crisis. It doesn't necessarily have to be a crisis. We do find that if you're a consumer products company, many of these crises that don't start as product crises become product crises. So just a few examples in our recent experience, Babies R Us, Toys R Us bankruptcy became a crisis for our industry. The one at the top left, some new research that indicated that our previously held beliefs related to how long a child should stay rear facing in a car seat were being challenged by some just new data, but not definitively. So what does that mean and how does that play out? Certainly tariffs have created crisis in our industry as baby products are subject to very high tariffs now. Most of the gear categories are subject to tariffs and what that does for ultimate cost for consumers who need these products. Certainly, as I said, these types of scenarios we believe, often lead to product crisis. And just an example of the way that unfolds, as I noted with tariffs, as costs increase, often parents choose secondhand product or maybe use product that has been subject to recall or just doesn't comply with the most recent standards in an effort to save money. And when that happens, the risk of accident or injury can certainly increase. So being mindful that as you're doing your own environmental scanning, that things can become crisis for your products, for your industry that aren't necessarily directly related to the construction of your individual product. Next slide. But of course, there are product safety crises, and we do have our fair share of them in the baby products industry. I use this one just by way of example because I think it's a great way to illustrate how multifaceted a crisis can become. So the topic here is the crisis related to inclined sleep products. Ultimately, this has resulted in the recall of over 5 million products in a beloved category among parents and caregivers. So, how do we define a crisis? In our world, certainly, just like Justice Potter Stewart said, we know it when we see it. but often that's very late. By the time that you see the crisis, it can be very late in the process. So as an association, do constant environmental scanning to identify areas where there may be potential risks. The other interesting point here is that, as most recalls these days are not related directly to compliance violations, they're related to misuse of a product, unintentional use of a product, or other unforeseeable circumstances. So many of the recalls we see, or I'm sorry, many of the crises we see that end up in recalls aren't directly related to perhaps the product that was being recalled, but to other companies that are operating in that sector and have similar or competing products. So, again, I think that it's when you talk about when does a crisis begin, or how do you foresee these crises, often they're being imposed on a company not even related to its own products or its own product life cycle. And a lot of the modeling historically we've seen, really starts with the compliance folks, the R&D folks, the QA folks in very honed in on your own products. Certainly that's important, but there's a much broader story to tell here, and a much broader way of looking at what could potentially be a crisis when you're deciding how to be prepared and how to set up your infrastructure to deal with it if it exists. The other thing that's really interesting about this particular scenario, and how we would define this crisis, is it didn't really start with the product. It originated from a Consumer Reports news story, the research of which came from CPSC's data leak. And this highlights a trend that we call activist media, and we're seeing it growing. And because the media protects its sources, it doesn't necessarily share its research or how they've come up with their findings, it really creates an uneven playing field. And this in and of itself is a crisis for industries that may be targeted. And it's often quite unforeseeable, generated from the media, and may or may not be related to what the company or the industry considers a product safety crisis. So activist media is certainly, a crisis in and of itself, from our perspective. And, certainly a bad media report can generate a crisis, again, even if the product itself isn't necessarily implicated. Next slide. So what do associations do to prepare for crisis? Relationship building, so that when it occurs, we can pick up the phone and talk to the right people within our member companies, understanding what products you're making, if you're entering new product categories, thoughts you may be having, media you've been subject to, media companies themselves, making sure that we have good relationships with them. So they do call us for that statement. So we do have the opportunity to weigh in on the crisis, and other stakeholders, so that, again, we can really formulate a very well-rounded approach to dealing with the crisis. We make sure that our experts are identified and in place. Again, similar to what you do as organizations, our crisis communications team, also subject matter experts in the variety of product categories. So, we do represent an industry, so we have to have a lot of knowledge about a lot of different types of products and how they may be similar or different from one another, so that we can make those differentiations when we're speaking to media. An industry or association strategist, Matt made the point that somebody needs to be in charge, and that cross-functional teams can be important. So, often we find that there are incredible linkages across a lot of the work that we do and across a lot of stakeholders, and someone who can really step back and identify what those may be is helpful to the team. And then also statements and talking points. So associations have statements and talking points from environmental scanning, identifying areas that are often the subject of media reports or can be subject to crisis situations, and making sure that those are up to date, so that if something hits, you can pull it very quickly and update it to the current situation, and you don't have to start from scratch. Certainly documenting a plan, testing it, refining it before the crisis occurs. That's best practice for everyone. Identifying the communications flow. In our case, that is a very lockdown approach, so that in a crisis, we call crisis to the entire team, and everybody knows immediately that anything related to that topic gets filtered through one individual that serves as the spokesperson, and also the hierarchy of responsibilities so that we know who's going to be the drafter, who's going to be the strategist, and who's going to respond to the media in any particular issue. Next slide. So in managing the crisis, just a bit of a visual, and some people, I've seen models of crisis management that look like a bell curve. We believe it looks a lot more like a heartbeat, in that it has points across the crisis that are high touch points, and then you'll have a flattening effect, and it tends to increase in stakeholder groups as you move across these touch points. So at the beginning of a crisis, the immediate response phase, the affected company or the affected product, we're dealing one-on-one with our member company to help craft the message, certainly getting that message out to media or responding to inbound media inquiries, and from a people perspective, managing our own staff and making sure that the proper hierarchies are in place. Then things tend to settle a moment, and then there's another heartbeat, right? Where maybe other companies in the same product category start either differentiating themselves or looking internally to see if there's an adjustment or a statement they need to make as well. Regulators may come into play. Sometimes, we'll have a dialogue on behalf of the whole industry with the regulated community. Retailers tend to come into play at this second phase as well. Sometimes retailers can, as we all know, be reactionary to products and really trying to just get ahead of it and maybe have a disproportionate response, in our opinion, to how they feel about certain products or product categories before the issue's been truly vetted. And then we'll have another flattening effect, and then there'll be yet another heartbeat where other external stakeholders can come into play. And these can vary greatly. NGOs are a great example, consumer advocacy groups, maybe different types of media, mom bloggers, et cetera, start to dialogue and get involved. And we find that then we need to take another action step as well. By the time you're at this point, often the company whose products were originally implicated, they feel like they're on the kind of backside of that bell curve, that they've kind of managed effectively through the crisis, where we're feeling this real funnel effect where there's really an opening up of a dialogue on the greater issue at that point. So distinguished a little bit from how the company itself may handle and think about the way a crisis unfolds. Next slide. So similarly, how long does this last? It can last a very long time from our perspective. So in the example I used of Incline Sleep Products, in April of 2019, this is when the data breach was announced. The Consumer Reports original article came out, the first large recall was issued. And as you work across these heartbeat touch points, you see there was research that in October of 2019, the CPSC issued a warning to stop using these products, and SNPR was issued. These are dialogue points where, again, the association can get involved and help manage the oratory. Just last December, the 10th recall of related products not necessarily even directly in this category of products, but related to this overall crisis occurred. And, today and moving forward, ASTM is still involved in the issue. There's a lot of dialogue about, again, what created some of the challenges that ultimately led to all of the recalls. What do we need to regulate moving forward? Again, we're still very involved in that. From the association and industry perspective, we're still very much in a time of crisis, believing that there's been even an overreaction, and helping to manage that as it all unfolds. Next slide. So my takeaways for you today is to just remember that your crisis may not be limited to your company or products, that others may be impacted, and an industry response can be really helpful in framing out that message and setting up the future dialogue. Remember that your association is a critical partner in your crisis. Communicate early and often. Make sure that you have the appropriate contacts within your association so that you can reach out to that person in times of crisis. And again, remember, we're here for feedback or to help talk through issues. If you are maybe not sure if a crisis might bleed into your category, if you're not directly involved in the early phases. Make sure your communications team is connected with our communications team. Share your press releases and public statements with your trade association. It's surprising sometimes how we read a press release that's out in the world and we haven't gotten wind of it beforehand, where, you know, again, just having that knowledge helps us craft our own positions and help mitigate perhaps some of the more negative impacts of the story. And then just check in with your trade association frequently to see if they've received any new information about your crisis, to see if the crisis is unfolding and becoming a bigger issue than maybe your immediate response to the acute crisis within your company might have planned for. Next slide. And thank you.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you, Heather and Matt as well. That was terrific content. We have unfortunately reached our time, which is very sad because I think we could have some tremendous dialogue here. But a couple of just quick points I wanted to reference for participants today. You know, we heard about Amazon and Mattel from Heather and CPSC from Matt, and certainly, you know, there's a lot of small organizations and companies out there who don't have those kinds of resources behind them and may not be well versed in how to manage a crisis, whether it's people or product related. And, you know, to put an emphasis on Kelly's point, your trade association is there to help you do that. So it's always important to have that plan in place, but the trade association can help you create it and provide some resources to lean on as well. So we did have a couple of questions come in, but I think unfortunately we are out of time. I want to be respectful of those of you who need to run to next meetings. But I think the key takeaway today, I scribbled down as Heather was talking. Heather said, we were in crisis mode 24/7, but there was no crisis in how we were going to handle it because we had a plan and the people knew how to implement it. And so I think that's one of the most important things we can all take away from our lessons learned here today. So once again, I want to thank our panelists, Kelly, Matt, Heather. You guys were amazing, provided great information. And for those of you who are planning to participate in all 4 sessions, there is an opportunity to achieve a certificate of completion. So keep an eye on your email from Product Safety. They'll share that information on how to do that before the session is over. And once again, our 4th and final panel will be next Thursday, same time, same place. And we look forward to seeing all of you then. Thank you once again for joining us. Thank you, panelists. And thank you again to UL for generous sponsorship. So have a great day. Thanks, everyone.